She is an embarrassment. My father said it so loudly, even Bennett Shaw, his own attorney, flinched. Then Richard Caldwell pointed across the courtroom at me as if I were not his daughter. Just a problem he wanted the judge to remove from the family record. She is unstable, Your Honor. She disappears for weeks, spends money without explanation, and lives like a drifter. This girl is insane. I did not move. That was the part he hated most. Not anger, not tears. Silence. The courtroom went still. My father stood at counsel table with one hand braced against the wood, face red, voice full of that old certainty he had worn my whole life. He had always believed that if he said something loudly enough, it became truth. I kept my hands folded in my lap and looked at the brass edge of the witness rail. My name is Irene Caldwell. I am 34 years old, and by the time my father called me an embarrassment in open court, I already knew exactly what kind of man he became when he was scared. Bennett reached toward his sleeve. Mr. Caldwell. My father pulled away. She cannot manage her own affairs, he said. She cannot manage money. She cannot manage herself. I am asking this court to do what this family should have done years ago. Years ago. That almost made me smile, because men like my father only reach for the past when they are desperate to control what happens next. Judge Sullivan watched him over her glasses, unreadable. Then he made his mistake. He straightened his tie, looked at me with open contempt, and said, She has never carried this family a single day in her life. I lifted my eyes and looked at him fully for the first time that morning. Then I turned to the judge. If he was this reckless already, how much longer before someone asked why he was in such a hurry to destroy me now? My father was still standing when I looked at him again, still wearing that old certainty that volume could pass for truth. I had seen it my whole life, at dinner tables, in driveways, in hospital hallways. He never started with facts. He started with a version that made him look strong and made someone else look small. Usually me. When I was 28, I handed him my business card over Sunday lunch. He turned it over once and set it beside his plate like he did not want it touching the tablecloth. A consultant, he said. That's a pretty word for unemployed. That same month, Ethan lost money on a deal with a college friend. My father called that ambition. That was the pattern. Ethan stumbled. My father renamed it promise. I worked, paid my own bills, kept my distance when I had to, and somehow that became instability. My mother knew it. I used to see it in the way she almost spoke, then didn't. The worst of it came after her stroke. I was at the hospital before sunrise 3 mornings in a row. I sat through scans, signed intake forms, spoke to nurses, and stopped by the house for her sweater. That was when I found the tax notice under a fruit bowl. Under it was another paper already signed by my father. 2 weeks later, I heard him tell people in the church parking lot, Ethan's been handling everything for his mother. Back in court. Bennett was reading more slowly now. Then he reached the financial appendix and stopped. Just half a second. But it was enough. Someone else in that room had finally found the one thread my father could not afford to have pulled. Bennett's pause should have slowed my father down. It did the opposite. Richard took that half second as proof he was winning. He planted both hands on the table and leaned harder into the performance. Your Honor, this is exactly what I've been trying to explain. My daughter is unstable. She disappears for weeks, ignores family calls, hides where she's living, and resurfaces when money is involved. Money. He said it like I had spent my life waiting for the family to weaken. She is not capable of handling the trust. She does not understand responsibility. She does not understand what it takes to hold a family together. Bennett cleared his throat. Mr. Caldwell, perhaps we should stay with the filing. My father did not even look at him. No. The court needs to hear this. Then he pointed at me again. She is insane. The word did not shock me. It fit too neatly with the others he had used for years. Difficult, cold, selfish, lost. He just thought this version would play better in court. She lives alone like a recluse. He went on. No husband, no normal life, no stability. This family has spent years cleaning up the confusion she leaves behind. My hands stayed folded. My face did not change. Inside, something settled. Then he pushed too far. That house is still standing because of me. This family is still standing because of me. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Sullivan said, voice sharp now. You will control your language in this courtroom. He opened his mouth anyway. That was when I smiled. Only a little. Judge Sullivan looked at him over her glasses. Mr. Caldwell? She said. Do you actually know who has been carrying this family? The room changed after that. Not loudly. Just enough to tell me my father had finally lost control of the story. He blinked at Judge Sullivan as if she had asked the wrong question. Bennett was already reaching for the new papers the bailiff had placed beside him, scanning faster now. Judge Sullivan did not rush. Mr. Caldwell, let's discuss the second mortgage placed on the family residence 11 months ago. My father straightened. That was a financial restructuring. He said it too smoothly. Judge Sullivan looked down at the file. A restructuring that led to a tax lien notice. A temporary issue. She turned another page, and a foreclosure filing halted shortly before deadline. Bennett stopped moving. I watched the color leave my father's face a little at a time. He tried to recover by turning back toward me. This is exactly my concern. Your Honor, my daughter inserts herself into matters she does not understand, hides what she is doing, and then uses secrecy as control. That is not healthy. That is not rational. Judge Sullivan did not look at me. That was new. She touched the page in front of her. The emergency payment that stopped the foreclosure did not come from you. My father said nothing. Her voice stayed even. Then who paid it? Mr. Caldwell. He kept staring ahead. And in that silence, Ethan looked down at the floor for the first time that morning, like he already knew exactly whose money had saved them. My father answered the way men like him always do when the lie starts failing. He made the truth sound dangerous. If Irene paid anything, he said, she did it without transparency, without permission, and without regard for the damage her interference causes. That is the pattern. She inserts herself into financial matters, hides what she is doing, and expects gratitude after the fact. There it was. Not I was wrong. Not I didn't know. But if she helped, that only proves she is a problem. That was my father's favorite trick, turn the rescue into the offense, and the damage into someone else's character flaw. Bennett tried once more. Your Honor, the question before the court is whether Miss Caldwell's behavior raises concerns about judgment, not whether she made an isolated payment during a family emergency. Judge Sullivan did not follow him. She looked at my father. If you believed your daughter lacked capacity, why was she permitted to handle matters involving your wife's care and the family residence at all? My father hesitated. She pushed her way in after Margaret's episode. She made herself useful where she could. That does not make her stable. It was a bad answer. He had just admitted I was trusted when things got serious. Then he made it worse. There were pressures in the family. He said, temporary setbacks. I was protecting my son from exposure over a business matter. Even Bennett looked done. Judge Sullivan lifted a wire transfer from the file and set it on the bench. This transfer came from Miss Caldwell's personal account, she said. No one moved. Then she added, and the date matters. Judge Sullivan placed the wire transfer beside the foreclosure notice, then beside the intake papers from my mother's rehab evaluation. The story my father had been telling did not look weak anymore. It looked arranged. "The dates," Judge Sullivan said. "Read them clearly." Bennett did. The transfer that stopped the foreclosure went out Thursday afternoon. My mother's rehab recommendation had been signed that same morning. A better facility had been available. The deposit was due by Friday. For the first time that day, I spoke. The money wasn't extra. No one interrupted me. I had just been paid from a major case. I said, that money was supposed to move my mother into a better recovery center and cover in-home help after. I had already called the facility. I had the paperwork in my bag. They were holding the room until Friday. My father went still. I kept my eyes on the judge, but the house was hours from being taken. I said, she had just had a stroke. I was not going to let her come home to notices on the door, a lien hanging over her head, and strangers walking through her rooms. My voice stayed calm, but I could still feel that day in my body. The hospital bracelet still on my wrist, the call from the lender, the tax notice under the fruit bowl, standing in my car outside the bank with the transfer form in my hand, knowing that whichever choice I made, my mother would pay for something my father had done. The room held still around that. Then I said the part I had never wanted my mother to hear in public. I didn't tell her because I didn't want her to know how far he had let it go. She was trying to learn how to walk steadily again. I was not going to let her learn at the same time that her home was slipping away. Bennett took off his glasses. Ethan stared at my father and did not blink. Richard tried one more time. You acted unilaterally. You hid financial activity. Enough, Judge Sullivan said. He stopped. She looked at the papers, then at me, then back at him. This is not the conduct of a woman incapable of judgment, she said. It is the conduct of the only person in this family who acted responsibly when it mattered. My father's voice came out smaller now. I didn't know. Judge Sullivan held his gaze. That, she said, is the problem. Once the room understood my father had not saved the house, the next question came fast. Then how had it gotten that bad? Judge Sullivan found the answer in the loan papers before anyone said it aloud. The secondary loss exposure tracks back to your son. Ethan shifted behind the rail, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere past me. My father moved too quickly. It was a business setback. Temporary. The kind of thing families handle privately. Families? He always used that word when he wanted silence from one child and protection for the other. Judge Sullivan kept reading. To contain that setback, you leveraged the house, delayed taxes, and made withdrawals tied to trust-related funds. My father tried again. He had investors lined up. It was supposed to close. The timing turned against him. That was Ethan in one sentence. Nothing was ever his fault. It was always timing, the market, the wrong partner. Bad luck. Never the years my father had spent confusing recklessness with promise and calling restraint a defect. Bennett stepped in carefully. Your Honor, my client's position is that these decisions were made under pressure, not with malicious intent. It was a smaller defense than before. Then my mother spoke. No, it was soft, but it changed the room. She looked at the papers, then at me. She was at the hospital every morning. Irene handled the forms. Irene spoke to the nurses. Irene brought me home. My father turned toward her. Margaret. She did not stop, and Ethan was not handling things. She said, he kept saying he would fix it. Richard kept saying not to worry me. Irene was the only one who did anything that helped. No one moved. That was the first time my mother had corrected the family story while my father was still in the room. Judge Sullivan lifted her eyes to him. So your son made the hole, and your daughter paid to keep the roof over your head. My father said nothing. My mother turned to look at him then, and for the first time in years, she did not look confused. She looked finished. By then, My father was no longer fighting to win. He was fighting to keep from collapsing in public. Judge Sullivan asked for the final attachment. The bailiff handed up a sealed affidavit and a thin set of trust papers. I recognized Helen Mercer's name before the judge read it aloud. Helen had been my grandmother's closest friend for 40 years. She did not sign things lightly. When I was 12, I once heard my grandmother say of her, "Helen remembers what people were hoping everyone else would forget." I had not understood it then. I did now. Judge Sullivan opened the affidavit first. Helen Mercer confirms she was present for the final amendment to the Caldwell Family Trust, and that it was made at the direct instruction of the grantor. My father's posture changed. Then the judge read the reason. My grandmother had believed Richard cared too much about appearances and too little about limits. She had believed Ethan was charming, but unready, and she had believed that under real pressure, the only person in the family likely to act without panic, vanity, or denial was me. The room went very still. My father stared at the papers like they had betrayed him. Men like him never believe the record until it stops obeying them. Judge Sullivan turned to the amendment itself. If Richard Caldwell uses trust-linked assets to conceal losses caused by Ethan Caldwell, or places the primary family residence in serious jeopardy through mismanagement, protective authority may be activated through Irene Caldwell on an emergency basis. The words were plain. Their meaning was not. My father had brought me to court to prove I could not be trusted with my own life. Now, his mother's final instructions were sitting in front of him, signed and waiting, prepared for the day he became the risk. Judge Sullivan closed the file. The court has heard enough. She said, but I already knew what would wound him most. Not the ruling. Not even the record. The fact that my grandmother had seen him clearly long before the rest of us had, and had trusted me to survive him when the day finally came. Judge Sullivan did not draw it out. The petition for conservatorship is denied, she said. In full? No flourish? No lecture? Just a clean end to the lie my father had tried to turn into law. Then she added what mattered almost as much. The record before this court shows no credible basis to question Miss Caldwell's capacity. What it does show is judgment, restraint, and documented responsibility under pressure. My father looked down at the table. Bennett did too, but for a different reason. He was no longer defending the story. He was thinking about exposure, filings, and what could still be salvaged on paper. Judge Sullivan continued, "This court also notes concerns regarding possible misuse of process and irregular financial conduct connected to the underlying family assets. Those matters may be reviewed separately if properly raised." That was enough. The room understood. Ethan was no longer hidden behind family privacy. My mother was no longer protected by silence, and my father was no longer standing inside the story he had told about himself for years. He had not lost everything that morning. He had lost something worse. The right to define me. For 1 second, he looked older than I had ever seen him. Not humbled, just exposed. Like a man hearing his own voice played back and realizing too late how it sounded to everyone else. I looked at him sitting there under the roof I had once helped save and understood, with a clarity that felt almost calm, that I would never carry him the same way again. When I turned to leave, I heard my name behind me, Irene. It was the first time all day he had said it without sounding like an order. I stopped, not because he still had a claim on me, because for the first time, he sounded like a man who understood that the daughter he had tried to erase was the one who had kept his life from collapsing. But understanding is not the same thing as earning your way back. I did not turn around. After court, I did not disappear. I went with my mother to review her care options myself. Not through my father. Not through Ethan. Not through another vague promise that someone would handle it later. I sat with the coordinator, asked direct questions, signed what needed signing, and made sure every arrangement was clear. My mother's care would move through documents, schedules, and decisions she could see. Not through favors, not through male pride, not through silence. My mother cried once in the parking lot, not loudly, just enough to tell me she finally understood that silence had never kept the peace. It had only protected the wrong people. I knew it was bad, she said. I just didn't know how bad. I looked at her and answered with the truth we should have said years earlier. You knew enough. It was the cruelest true thing I had ever said to her, and also the most necessary. I did not punish her for that, but I did not make it easier, either. If we were going to build anything new, it would have to be built in the open. Ethan had to face his own mess. My father kept the house, but not the old fantasy that it stood because of him. Now he knew what had held it up, and who had. That was enough. I did not stop loving my family that week. I stopped loving them in the old way, the invisible way, the useful way, the way that asked me to bleed quietly and call it duty. When I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, not because I had won, because I was no longer holding up a whole house full of people determined not to see my hands beneath it. Some families do not fall apart when you stop saving them. They just have to stand on their own. Sometimes love does not end when the truth comes out. It just stops hiding behind sacrifice. If you have ever been the one carrying everything quietly, tell me in the comments, would you have turned around or kept walking?